Let me take you into a forgotten corner of history. Imagine this: a single-seat fighter plane roars above the clouds, the sun burning red behind it. At the controls sits not a hardened veteran, not a grizzled commander, but a young woman with eyes sharp as steel, and a heart that had carried her farther than the world ever thought she would fly. She tilts her wings toward the horizon. The radio crackles once, then silent. She was never heard from again. Her name was Evelyn Hart, though most people today have never heard it. She wasn't supposed to be a pilot. She wasn't even supposed to be near the cockpit. In the 1940s, women in the United States were expected to type reports, stitch uniforms, or wave goodbye to husbands heading overseas, but Evelyn was cut from different cloth. From the time she was a little girl on her family's farm in Kansas, she would look at the sky and tell anyone who'd listen, "One day, I'll ride the clouds." They laughed at her, of course, neighbors, school teachers, even her own family. But Evelyn wasn't the kind of person you could laugh out of a dream. By the time the war broke out, she had already earned her civilian pilot's license by scrubbing hangars for lessons and sneaking late-night hours in worn-out training planes. When the call came for women pilots to ferry aircraft across the country, relieving men for combat, she didn't hesitate. She joined the Women Air Force Service Pilots, or WASPs. They weren't given the same uniforms as men. They weren't given the same honors, and they weren't given the same recognition if they died. But they were given the stick, the sky, and a chance. That was enough for Evelyn. Her fellow pilots remembered her as fearless, sometimes to the point of reckless. Where others kept to the book, Evelyn had a streak of daring that made her both admired and a little feared. She was the kind of flyer who would loop her trainer just to prove it could be done, the kind who leaned into turbulence as if daring the storm to throw her. Yet beneath that bold exterior, she carried a quiet weight, letters folded in her flight jacket, photographs tucked behind her altimeter, reminders of a family who didn't quite understand why she chose the sky over a safe life on the ground. It was late summer of 1944 when Evelyn received her last assignment. On paper, it was routine. Ferry a P-51 Mustang, a sleek, deadly fighter, across the country for shipment overseas. She had done missions like this dozens of times. But something about this one felt different. The Mustang had been freshly tuned, its engine hotter than usual, its gauges temperamental. Before she left, one mechanic swore he heard her mutter, "If this thing wants to fight me, I'll fight it right back." The morning of her departure was unusually calm. Witnesses at the airfield remembered how the dawn painted the horizon pink as she pulled on her leather gloves and climbed into the cockpit. Another pilot joked, "Don't get lost up there, Hart." She smirked, saluted, and with a roar of the Merlin engine, the Mustang lifted from the runway and disappeared into the clouds. Hours passed. The radio logs show she checked in once, her voice calm and steady. Northbound, smooth flight. Then nothing. No distress call, no mayday, no coordinates. Just silence. By nightfall, when she still hadn't arrived at her destination, search crews fanned out. For days they scoured the countryside, combed forests, and swept rivers. Pieces of wreckage turned up here and there, scraps that could have belonged to any number of planes, but no trace of Evelyn. Not the Mustang. Not her. The military quietly closed the file. Women pilots were considered civilians, not military personnel, so no official honors were issued. No folded flag was delivered to her parents. Her name was penciled into a thin report marked missing. And just like that, Evelyn Hart, the girl who had fought the odds to touch the sky, was gone. But here's where the story refuses to rest. Decades later, in the 1970s, hikers deep in the forests of Montana stumbled across twisted aluminum, buried beneath trees, a fragment of wing, faded U.S. markings, and etched faintly on the metal, almost lost to rust and weather, two letters scratched by hand, EAAA. Aviation historians were called in. The part matched the model of Mustang Evelyn had flown, but when recovery teams returned to the site, the wreckage had vanished, swept away by a sudden flood that tore through the canyon. Whatever evidence might have proven Evelyn's fate was washed downstream, lost forever. Then, more whispers surfaced. A letter found in an archive from a fellow WASP hinted that Evelyn had confided a suspicion before her last flight, that she believed one of the test mechanics had been covering up faulty repairs. "If I don't come back," the letter read, "it won't be because I got lost. Someone didn't want this plane in the air." A shocking line, one that raises more questions than it answers. Was Evelyn the victim of sabotage? a careless oversight? Or did she push her daring too far in an aircraft that couldn't handle it? The truth remains tangled in shadows. But what endures is the silence around her name. While men who vanished in combat were enshrined as heroes, Evelyn and dozens of other women pilots who never returned were nearly erased from memory. No medals, no parades, no headlines, just families told to quietly move on. And yet, every time you hear the thunder of a modern jet or see contrails streak across a blue sky, think of Evelyn Hart. A woman who looked at a world that said no and flew anyway. A woman whose final flight was never accounted for, but whose courage still hums in the engines of every pilot who dares the unknown. Perhaps her plane lies rusting in some forgotten canyon. Perhaps it sank to the bottom of a hidden riverbed. Or perhaps, just perhaps, the truth is still waiting, locked in a file, buried under decades of dust, waiting for someone curious enough to ask the questions that were never answered. What we do know is this: Evelyn Hart flew into history not with fanfare but with silence. And sometimes, silence speaks louder than any anthem. She never returned from her final flight. But maybe, just maybe, that's why her story still refuses to land. Because in the end, it isn't just about a missing plane. It's about remembering a woman who was told she couldn't and did. A pilot who vanished into the clouds but left behind something stronger than wreckage, a legacy. And that, perhaps, is the most unforgettable thing of all.